Chapter 25 of The Silk-Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Round the Good for X. Roger leaned back in his chair and drew in 2 or 3 satisfying lungfuls of smoke. So the good old French method of reconstructing the crime in the presence of the suspected person can claim one more triumph, he said. It's a pity Scotland Yard is so conservative, isn't it? For all that, Mr. Sheringham, observed Superintendent Green, conservative methods pay all right in most cases. But they never would have in this, Roger retorted, and so I've said from the very beginning, haven't I, Moresby? You have, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby agreed. He could not help himself. Roger certainly had said that, more than once. It was 3 o'clock, rather more than 2.5 hours after Plato had been removed, raving and struggling from the Albany, and a quartet was sitting in Roger's study composed of the triumphant novelist himself, the assistant commissioner, and the 2 officers in charge of the case. In the next room, Anne was still lying down after her ordeal, with Moira holding one of her hands and Jerry Newsom the other, completely happy in the vindication of the desperate plan in which she had played so gallant a part. Her lapse into unconsciousness had been but momentary. Although it seemed hours at the time, her period of suspension had actually been only 40 seconds, according to Roger's wristwatch, and her recovery considerably more rapid and less unpleasant than on the previous day, when she had had a severe blow on the head to contend with as well. The terrible shock of realizing himself unmasked before all those witnesses had toppled Plato's brain, merely balanced on the verge as it had been, finally over into the abyss of complete insanity. In his own financial line, he had been a genius, and genius being already abnormal, the curtain between it and the more ultimate abnormality of madness is always thin. In Plato's case, it had always been not merely thin, but ragged. A severe shock at any time and of any sort, such as financial disaster, might have sufficed to tear it down altogether. And now that the shock had come, down it had gone. A general sigh of relief had gone up when the fact became realized. It was far the best thing that could have happened, for had Plato remained sane, repudiated his confession, and pleaded not guilty, it was still a little doubtful whether he could have been convicted on such actual evidence as there was against him. The assistant commissioner, in his relief generous without stint of praise and congratulations, had stayed to lunch in the Albany, and now the 2 officers, their prisoner safely disposed of, and the formalities duly performed, had come back to listen to their amateur colleague's story. To them, no less than to the assistant commissioner himself, the identification of Plato with the maniac they had been hunting had come as a complete and paralyzing surprise. And we can't say that you were watching them all and hit on him as the most likely, Mr. Sheringham, Moresby admitted, because you'd written his name in that envelope you gave the commissioner beforehand. That's why I gave it him, Roger grinned. I knew you'd say something like that if I didn't. And Mr. Sheringham dropped a note on my knee at the beginning, telling me to keep an eye on Plato, too, Sir Paul added. I was afraid he might get violent, Roger explained. That's why I put you in a place of vantage behind him. When did you first begin to suspect him, Mr. Sheringham? Asked Superintendent Green. The superintendent had thawed considerably since 12 o'clock, but it was evident that he still considered an amateur had no right at all to succeed where the Yard had failed. Yesterday afternoon, Roger replied, after the attack on Miss Manners. That's all. I won't say he hadn't crossed my mind before that, but never really seriously. And when I did come to consider him seriously, of course, I soon became positive. The more I thought about it, in fact, the more obvious it became. And I knew the real criminal, whoever he was, must have a key to Newsom's front door, a false beard and a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, to say nothing of that pestle-shaped weapon of hard rubber. So that's how I was able to include the list of those things as waiting for you in Plato's rooms in the envelope I gave Sir Paul beforehand. Yes, and there we found them, right enough, admitted Moresby readily, though, as you said, they weren't much in the way of real proof. But how did you get over his alibis, Mr. Sheringham? I don't understand that even now. How did he kill that girl in Pelham Mansions at the same time as he was eating lunch with you at your club? Roger took a pull at the tankard by his side. Out in the world, a grandmotherly government was forbidding its citizens to quench their noble thirsts with good 4x. In the Albany, with the help of a nice round-bellied cask, such feeble puerilities could be disregarded. "Fill up, you two," said Roger. "There's a gallon or two left, and I hate stale beer. I'm going to begin at the beginning, so fortify yourselves." With happy grins, the two representatives of the same grandmotherly government took the necessary steps towards fortifying themselves. "Monte Carlo is the beginning," said Roger, "so I'll begin there. Well, the truth is that there never was a murder at Monte Carlo at all. The French police were right. That was a perfectly genuine suicide, so there goes alibi number one. But that was what gave Plato his idea. He arrived just afterwards, you remember, and must have heard plenty of talk about it. The thing tickled his imagination. He may have been overworking, or his health may have been bad. Anyhow, he had probably got into a queer state. You can picture him brooding over that girl hanging on the door by one of her own stockings. He loved it. Nothing would satisfy him but that he must see such a thing happen. So the first thing he does when he gets back to England is to do it. You must remember that Plato suffered badly from megalomania. I noticed that on several occasions. If I say a thing is, then it is. If I say the impossible shall be done, then it shall. But he was so quiet about it, while the usual megalomaniac is so bombastic that one simply didn't recognize it for what it was. Anyhow, that gave him the idea that all was possible to him, that if it amused him to see girls die in this way, then it was only right that girls should die for his pleasure, and that, of course, he could never be suspected, much less found out. I was with him once in the street when we met Miss Carruthers, and was rather surprised to find that he knew her. It turned out, however, that he was financially behind the show she's in. It never occurred to me at the time, but of course there was his connection with Unity Ransom. Perhaps he didn't even go to Sutherland Avenue with the idea of killing her. He may have seen his opportunity and just taken it. Probably that is what happened. As for the note left in that case, and the next, I can't tell you exactly how he induced the girls to write them, but you can picture well enough the sort of thing that must have happened. Perhaps he offered them a new fountain pen and wanted to see how it suited their writing. Perhaps he was pretending to tell their characters from their handwriting. Anything like that. All we can say definitely is that he dictated and induced them, somehow or other, to take down his words verbatim. But it evidently wasn't easy, because in the last case, where he had no time to waste, he contented himself with cutting out a verse from a handy volume of poetry. Well, the death of Janet Manners whetted his appetite. He stood off for 6 weeks. Then he went for that poor little prostitute, Elsie Benham. That, of course, was his safest line. There's no connection to be traced in those cases at all. But I don't expect he was worrying about being traced. He would be immune from that sort of thing. And so next, we have him actually killing his own fiancée. Now that I do not see how anyone could be expected to tumble to, Mr. Sheringham, said Moresby, without much grammar, but with considerable feeling. Why not? Roger retorted. Neither of us did, as it happens, but that was because we both fell into the same error. We assumed that the engagement was a happy one. As a matter of fact, it wasn't anything of the kind. That never came out at the inquest, of course, but it was common gossip among their own small circle of intimates. That complete idiot Newsom only thought to mention it to me at 1 a.m. this morning, after I'd been questioning him about the two of them for a couple of hours on end. But you made a worse mistake than I did, because when you heard that Newsom and Lady Ursula had been very thick at one time, you thought that her subsequent engagement to Plato gave Newsom a motive for killing her. Knowing Newsom, I never thought that. What it actually did was give Plato the motive." The assistant commissioner, who had heard all this before, nodded sagely. "From what I can gather," Roger went on, "Lady Ursula was always in love with Newsom and engaged herself to Plato in sheer desperation when she became convinced that Newsom wasn't in love with her. He had no idea of this, of course, and hasn't now, but it's quite plain to me. Well, that didn't make for a happy engagement, did it? As I see it, they were continually quarreling, and Lady Ursula was always on the verge of breaking it off till they fell in with each other that night. Plato never had a real alibi for that night, you remember, and had one final grand bust-up when Lady Ursula, very nervy and suffering from a bad headache, finally gave him his congé. Probably they went into that studio to have their quarrel in private, and Plato, his megalomania utterly outraged, simply took what he considered the proper steps to restore it to self-respect. There was a struggle in that case because he hadn't got his weapon with him, and he had to tie her wrists and ankles, and no doubt he gagged her in the way I first suggested, Moresby, when we reconstructed the case, if you remember." Moresby nodded. "Yes, I remember. With a scarf or something like that, you said. But what about the note, Mr. Sheringham?" "Ah, yes, that note," Roger smiled. "I felt in my bones all the time that the note was taking you on the wrong track, Moresby, but you wouldn't listen. You see, one thing struck me forcibly about that note, but I didn't mention it to you because I knew you wouldn't pay any attention. It was the way it was folded. You pointed out that the main fold didn't come in the middle, and so something must have been cut off the top. But you quite missed the point later on that, if it was the man for whom it had been left who made use of it afterwards, the fold would have been in the center because he would have cut the top off before he folded it, not after. That told me, as soon as I heard from the valet that the note had not been left in an envelope, that it was not the man for whom it had been left who used it, but someone else who had got possession of it, folded it, and carried it off before cutting it. You see?" "Oh, Mr. Sheringham, come," expostulated Moresby. "That's too subtle altogether." "That's exactly what I knew you'd say," Roger replied equably. "So I didn't say it. But I deduced from that subtle bit of reasoning that somebody might be in illegal possession of one of Newsom's keys. And lo, when I questioned his valet, I found that one of his keys actually was missing. Newsom had had his pocket picked some weeks ago and his keys and wallet stolen. It was Plato, of course, looking for letters from Lady Ursula, and no doubt he thought the keys would come in uncommonly handy, too. The truth is patent enough if one reads between the lines. Plato knew all about Newsom and Lady Ursula, and he was mad jealous of Newsom. He was always trying to get some evidence that the two were on more intimate terms than those of happy-go-lucky friendship. Hence the pocket-picking. I've no doubt he was in the habit of shadowing Lady Ursula. At any rate, he must have seen her go into Newsom's flat the day before the murder. That may have clinched his suspicions. We can't tell. Anyhow, as soon as the valet was out of the way, he went in too, with that handy key, and found the note. He took it, seeing at once the use to which he could put it if occasion arose. Oh, Moresby, why didn't you take a hint from me and try what would happen if one assumed that Newsom was speaking the truth and it was the facts, not he, that were at fault? Well, I don't know whether Plato realized at the time, though he certainly did later, that he had, wittingly or unwittingly, built up a very pretty case against Newsom. The next thing to do was to develop it, and so we come to the last murder. So far, we've had murders with two different motives. Out of the series of 4, only the first 2 were pure lust murders. Lady Ursula's was a vengeance murder, or a megalomania murder, if you like. The last was a murder committed with the sole motive of increasing the strength of the case against the man he loathed. by being preferred to himself in Lady Ursula's affections. You see, Newsom had committed the unforgivable sin. He must be eliminated at all costs, and very cunningly the trap was laid. Here Roger paused to prevent a little more beer from going stale. Plato was a cunning man, you see. Oh, very cunning. Do you know what brought him to Scotland Yard, Moresby? Not any vague suspicions, as we thought at the time, but that paragraph in the Evening Clarion which you showed me, saying that the police were taking an interest in Lady Ursula's death and hinting at exciting developments. Plato knew well enough that the police don't take an interest in death unless something like murder is suspected. He did a bit of hard thinking, put himself in our minds, and proceeded to act precisely as we should expect him to, and very well he played his part, too. But he wanted more than that. He wanted to be kept abreast of our investigations and know every minute just what we thought, were doing, and were going to do. And there I admit frankly that I was the mug. I offered him what he wanted with both hands. Well, Plato didn't mind the police investigations, not he. He welcomed it, and it amused him terribly. There was no question that he himself could ever be suspected, you see, and now he could go right ahead with his case against Newsom. And he went. Having worked out his plot, he proceeded to put it into operation. He went in disguise to a girl in one of his shows. Did you know he was behind her husband's wife, too? I found that out from Miss Deeping on the telephone last night, so that he wouldn't be recognized if seen outside. Rang her bell, whipped off the disguise, and went in. No doubt he'd telephoned to her in advance, or knew in some other way that the coast was perfectly clear till well after lunch. Well, he'd worked out a very clever alibi and had no time to waste. The first thing he does is to tell the girl that a friend of his called Gerald Newsom is extremely interested in her. All this is only guesswork, of course, but it must be near enough to the facts. And has consulted him about putting up the money for a show in which she would be the star. Of course, he'd have chosen a girl who did know Jerry. Newsom has said something about taking her out to lunch that day to discuss the proposition. Has she heard from him? No, says the girl, thoroughly excited. She hasn't. Then if I were you, I should ring him up at once and clinch it, says Plato, and tell him 1 o'clock, not earlier, because I want to talk it over with you myself till then. And naturally, the girl promptly does it. So there is Newsom's presence, guaranteed for 1 o'clock, with the certainty that the porter will see him enter. I was assuming, by the way, that Plato knew enough about Pelham Mansions to have heard about that porter. That also was confirmed last night, as I'll explain later. Now, this next bit of deduction, I must tell you, is one that I really am proud of. It's all based on those dints in the girl's legs. I'd already made up my mind, you see, that the solicitor-looking man was the murderer, and his trimmings were a disguise, though I hadn't the least idea then who he was. But I was sure that his object was to establish an alibi, and I had become convinced independently that the girl was alive inside when Newsom rang the bell, but under forcible restraint. I shouldn't say deductions, by the way. This was pure induction. I took these various assumptions and deliberately built up my case to prove them. Very naughty, wasn't it, Moresby? Putting myself in his place, then, I asked myself, how could I cause that girl to die exactly 3/4 of an hour after I was safely out of the way? That puzzled me for some time, till I began to wonder, wasn't there some method by which, having made her unconscious, I could place her in such a physical position that the very act of regaining consciousness would make her bring about her own death? To have thought of that question was the great step. The answer soon came. Yes, by stunning her with some yielding instrument on the principle of the sandbag, by means of a blow hard enough to keep her unconscious for an hour or so without cracking her skull. That would leave no bruise, you see, and would be quite undiscoverable at a post-mortem unless the actual brain were examined, which would be highly unlikely. I needn't explain to you experts, of course, that a blow with an instrument of that nature stuns by bruising the brain, which, being a little loose inside the skull, is thrown violently against the bone on the farther side. I didn't actually hit on the idea of hard rubber as the material then, but of course, when Miss Manners explained to me later the short glimpse she had caught of the weapon which stunned her, I realized what it must be. Well, having stunned her in that way, with a blow sufficiently forcible to keep her unconscious for about an hour, the next thing he could do, I imagined, would be to prop her on the back of a chair, leaning back and balanced against an open door, with the stocking already in position around her neck and fastened to the hook, and the chair tilted in such a way that the slightest movement would destroy the balance of the whole erection. The door would then swing to, you see. The chair, on whose back she was half sitting, half lying, would follow it, sinking gradually to the floor as the door closed, and the girl would be left hanging. And the particular beauty of the plan is that the first movement made by a person who has been knocked out is a rolling of the head, which would affect nothing. But the second is a sort of stretching movement of the legs and the body. I've been knocked out myself more than once, and I know. The latter movement, of course, would cause her feet to press on the seat of the chair, which would at once push herself and the door away from it. The next impulse, by the way, is to be sick, but the immediate strangulation would prevent that. "And you worked all that out just from those dints in her legs, Mr. Sheringham?" asked Superintendent Green, with real respect at last. "More or less," said Roger proudly, "together with the particular chair he used, with a very high back, and the fact that she was not wearing her wrapper. If he had gone to the trouble of removing that from her, it must have been with some particular reason, and the only reason I could see was that it was getting in the way of whatever he wanted to do with her. And what is more, Superintendent and Chief Inspector both, having worked it out, I went round to the flat to examine the door for the two tiny dints which the knobs on either side of the chair back should have made in the paintwork, and the infinitesimal scratches they ought to have left as they slithered down to the floor. And there I found them." "Well," said the superintendent, nobly burning all his boats, "that's as clever a piece of reasoning as ever I heard." "Thank you," said Roger, "and all by the inductive method, which you people don't use. By the way, one other thing had occurred to me. A limp body is a difficult thing to balance like that, and I thought he would anticipate some difficulty in preventing the door from shutting prematurely. What, in that case, would be better than a nut wedged in between the frame and the door? It would hold the balance, you see, and yet crack when the extra pressure was applied. And there, in the dust at the bottom, I found the fragments of a walnut shell." "Well, I'll be blowed," quoth Chief Inspector Moresby. Expanding like a flower before the warmth of these official compliments, Roger continued. "And it was the wrapper, I should add, which told me that Plato's first action on getting inside the flat was to tell her the exciting news connected with Newsom, and that he struck her down as soon as she'd hung up the telephone receiver. That was a simple deduction from what Miss Deeping had to say about the habits of her friend concerning visitors and wrappers. Well, that was that. All the murderer had to do then was to put on his disguise again and walk out, and his alibi was established by the porter. At first, when I began to realize that the solicitor was our man, I had thought that, knowing the habits of the porter, he had sneaked back as soon as the latter had gone to lunch. But I was right in thinking I had made a mistake there, and the man wanted not only the porter's negative evidence, but somebody else's positive testimony as well. I provided the latter for him by paying for his lunch, and when Newsom rang the bell later, according to plan, the girl was still alive inside. Could anything have been neater? and the case against Newsome after that was nothing less than glaring, as Plato knew it would be. And that brings us to the attack on Miss Manners yesterday. Plato would have been better advised to forego that. It gave him away at last. And the curious thing is that, lost to everything else as the girl lay helplessly at his mercy, he not only forgot to give the 10-minute signal himself, as of course he intended, but actually stepped on his own alarm bell. Could anything be more ironical? What a perfect mixture of superhuman cunning and complete idiocy. Yes, that last attempt was a real madman's effort. He realized, of course, as soon as he'd done it, and darted out to hide on the lower landing till I had fled past. But by that time he'd spoilt his own game. At first I was hopelessly at sea. I'd never expected for a moment to get any results with such a poor little trap for such a very clever spider. I began by thinking that it must be one of our 5 suspects, and wondered if it really could be Beverly, as Miss Manners had told me the same morning. This attack cleared up certain points on which I had been still doubtful, and confirmed others. It definitely settled the question of the weapon, and explained the absence of any struggle, except in Lady Ursula's case. It also showed that I had been wrong in my first reconstruction regarding the scarf, but that did not help much. Then it occurred to me that there might be a double object in this case, not only to eliminate Miss Manners, but also to throw still further suspicion on Newsome, for I was convinced by this time that somebody was deliberately trying to do just that thing, and with a malicious vindictiveness that argued a substantial motive. Did that give me a pointer? Who had anything against Newsome? So far as I could see, only Plato. And as I told you, I laughed at myself. Then I thought, why should anyone want to eliminate Miss Manners? Even if the existence of our trio of inquiry were known, she was the least important member of it. Why not eliminate Plato or myself? Could there possibly be any reason for her elimination beyond her membership of our trio? Because it was clear that this was not a haphazard attack, or so I thought. There was some hidden reason for it, and at once I remembered a conversation she had had with me that same morning. Briefly, she had suggested then a new line of inquiry, to put out feelers as to whether a man, not answering to Newsome's description but wearing a beard and gold-rimmed glasses, had been seen in the neighborhood of Miss McLean's studio after the crime. That was significant, you see, and she had already arrived at the independent conclusion that the bearded man at Pelham Mansions was the real murderer, though she thought he was Arnold Beverly, and I had an open mind. But what now occurred to me as in the highest degree interesting was that she had mentioned this to Plato earlier in the morning, and he had as good as asked her not to say anything about it to me, and had got her to agree that it would be fun to follow it up behind my back. You see, there was evidently something in it, and he didn't want it investigated. Moreover, he had heard her say the day before that she had a new idea, and that we had been blind, and she had promised to tell me after tea the next day. If Plato were the murderer, I thought, that would give him a real motive for getting rid of her before she had told me anything. Well, that put me on to the idea of Plato in real earnest, and immediately things began to fall into their places. Plato was not in his office in the city when we rang him up immediately after the attack. Why not? Because he was in Maida Vale. He arrived in Sutherland Avenue much quicker than he could have done from his board meeting. Why? Because he was so anxious to see if he were suspected after the incident of the alarm bell. His first action on being alone with me was vehemently to accuse Newsome afresh. Why? To put me off himself. And one of the first things he said was that it must be Newsome, because he was the only one who knew. Why did he say that? Newsome wasn't. Plato really had passed the word to the other suspects about the sittings. But what was significant was that Plato was the only one who knew that Newsom was on the premises. And there were hundreds of other little things of the same kind, not only in that case, but in all the others. In fact, once I had begun to see seriously whether Plato would fit, he fitted everywhere. I spent an interesting 10 minutes soothing him by pretending to agree about Newsom and doing my utmost to get the girls out of his clutches. I told him I was going to take them to the Piccadilly Palace, where doubtless he would have followed and attacked Miss Manners again in the middle of the night. But when we got there, I told the others to wait in the taxi while I booked their rooms. Then I ran inside, waited a minute, and ran out to tell them that the place was full. I didn't want them to suspect Plato, you see, because I wasn't sure, but I did want to get those two safe inside the Albany for the night. Well, if I wasn't sure before dinner, I was after. Apart from the few but very significant things I found out from Newsom and on the telephone, I got a report I'd asked for about the other inhabitants of Pelham Mansions. One of the girls there was reputed to be kept by Plato. That, to my mind, clinched it. Then I was up against the problem of proving it, and there was no real proof. At least none that could not quite easily be explained away. I was morally convinced, but what, as Moresby says, is the good of that? And as for attempting to assemble any convincing proofs within 18 hours to prevent you people from arresting Newsom, well, I ask you. So I thought of the usual French method of reconstructing the crime and testing the suspect's reactions, and wondered whether anything could be done in that line. And the more I thought of it, the more I was sure not only that it was the only possible way, but that some sort of reaction might be confidently expected if we made the scene convincing and horrible enough. So I hit on that quite impossible plan, and listed plucky little Miss Manners, to whom, and that undeserving Jerry Newsom who's going to get her, I drain this tankard, cajoled Scotland Yard into sitting through the performance, forced myself through quite the most unpleasant 10 minutes of my life, and there we are. Oh, and of course, I couldn't warn Plato, even by innuendo, what the real object of the mummery was, and so I had to spin that yarn about a representative gathering of citizens and all that nonsense. That's all. But I do wish Plato hadn't gone quite mad at the end. I should like to have had a chance to probe into his mind a little further first. His psychology, of course, is absorbing. I don't suppose for a moment that he considered himself a murderer, you know. He killed, but he didn't murder. His mind, when the action was applied to himself, is sure to have conceived some subtle differentiation. And he really had rather a nice sense of humor, you know, with it all. He must have been hugging himself all this time, not only looking on at the futile hunt for himself, but even assisting in it. How his tongue must have been in his cheek when I think of some of the things he's said to me. Well, it's a pity that quite the most interesting brain that any of us is likely to meet has turned out to be a mad one. But I suppose one can't have everything, and that really does appear to be all. The remaining contents of the tankard descended the way of all good beer. Faculus descensus taverni, said Roger, smacking his lips. He looked round at the three thoughtful faces and grinned widely. He was feeling rather more pleased with Roger Sheringham than ever before, and he wanted a victim. Moresby was the selection. Roger felt he owed Moresby just what the chief inspector was going to get. He rose and clapped him happily on the shoulder. "Do you know what's the matter with you real detectives at Scotland Yard, Moresby?" he asked kindly. "You don't read enough of those detective stories." End of chapter 25. End of The Silk Stocking Murders by Anthony Berkeley.